The town of Wolfston on the chasm is unremarkable except for its rather bizarre name, and of course, its chasm. It is located at the terminus of the railway, and it was this circumstance that prompted the town fathers in Victorian times to change its former unattractive name, Rathbury, in the hope of attracting more tourists. The only feature that sets this otherwise unremarkable town, set in pleasant but unimpressive scenery, apart is the aforementioned chasm, and it was a downside that visitors almost never saw it. Even on the sunniest summer days, the bottom remained stubbornly shrouded in fog, and during the rest of the year, this fog often thickened to a state that made it difficult to see the abyss, sometimes even obscuring the approaches to it. More impressionable writers described it as an abyss spewing a dark miasma. But the fact remained that attracting tourists to something they most likely would not see was not easy. Like any decent spectacle, the abyss needed a story, preferably terrifying and fascinating, and ideally with elements of mystery. Unfortunately, the chasm seemed to have no such history. However, this was no deterrent to the intrepid promoters of the city's tourism potential, who hired a local historian, Jeremiah Integrity Hall, his unusual middle name, a clear refutation of the theory of nominative determinism, and asked him to create history. They were of the opinion that the job of a historian is to write history and to make it up when it is missing or unknown. Jeremiah was more than willing to go along with it as long as he got paid, and the more he got paid, the more history he created for the abyss. The term overreach did not exist in Victorian times, but if it had, it might have been applied to the moment Hall suggested that King Arthur's legendary sword, Excalibur, was thrown into its depths. All that remained of Hall's over-the-top fantasies was the idea that it was used by the ancient Druids, who he claimed made sacrifices to the dark gods. They worshipped by casting innocents into the abyss. This myth, although there was no evidence at the time, took root in the minds of local residents, since it was quite plausible given the oppressive and sinister atmosphere of the place. In a turn of events that showed that fate does indeed have a somewhat twisted sense of humor, in the late 1980s, a team of archaeologists discovered a sealed cave at the bottom of a chasm containing skeletal remains dating back to approximately 3,000 years ago that showed signs of having fallen from great heights and were decorated with luxurious decorations. Apparently, they had flippantly donned the jewelry at the time of the fall, which meant that the local museum now had an exhibition of incredibly valuable but rather mangled torques, bracelets, rings, and necklaces. Another feature of Wolf's Den on the chasm, at least in the eyes of its owners, the Urquhart Drago family, is their ancestral seat, Wolf's Den Castle. Of course, this is not a castle at all, but a very ordinary mansion with a few decorative and unconvincing battlements. However, it is best not to mention this in their presence, since another trait that runs in their family, along with self-esteem, lack of a moral compass, and a complete lack of humor, is an extremely painful reaction to the slightest criticism. Like many other already wealthy families, the Urquhart Dragos were greatly enriched by the compensation. The British government paid to former slave owners when they abolished the institution. However, there was one curious thing about the Urquhart Drago case. They never owned slaves. But the family never lacked ingenuity when it came to creative dishonesty, and the money made was multiplied by capitalizing on the recent invention of one James Greville, which made it possible to build larger and more powerful steam engines at a lower cost. Unfortunately, Greville's understanding of people was far worse than his engineering skills, and too late he realized that his friend and benefactor, Sir William Urquhart Drago, was neither one nor the other, and secretly registered a patent for your name. Thus, the descendants of Urquhart Drago lived in privilege and luxury, while the Grevilles did not. May 2018. When Julie Greville finally got home, and having paid the taxi driver turned to face him, she was relieved to notice that there were no lights on in the windows. She hoped that her husband was already asleep in bed, and conversations could be left until the morning. She walked into the house as quietly as possible, took off her shoes, and headed to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of water before going to bed. She turned on the light and shuddered in fear. Jake was sitting at the table, facing the door, dressed as if he was going out, his coat hanging over the back of his chair. His face was pale and haggard. Before she could say anything, he spoke in a low, even voice, without even looking at her. "You never wore stockings for me." Julie was taken by surprise. An almost empty glass stood in front of him. Apparently there was whiskey in it, and Jake almost never drank spirits. The bottle of whiskey they had was a gift, and had remained virtually untouched in the 6 months they had received it. She tried to think of something to say, but he spoke again. "Even on our wedding night, you didn't put on stockings for me, but you didn't put them on for him." Julie went cold. Her brain stopped working. When she spoke, it was without any hesitation. "Who are you talking about, Jake?" He still didn't look at her, and his voice remained low, almost monotone. "You never wore stockings for me, but you did for your date with Henry Urquhart Drago." Now she was completely stunned, trying to figure out how to respond, but she couldn't come up with anything sensible, although she had to try. "No, Jake, you got it all wrong. It wasn't a date, and I didn't wear stockings for him. Jake had never interrupted her, but this time he did, and there was now some strength in his voice. "If this is not for him, then for whom? Because as far as I saw, it was just the two of you in that bar." Julie began to realize how bad it looked and foolishly tried to answer. "Were you following me? Were you spying on me?" She expected him to be at least a little defensive, but she quickly realized her mistake. "Yes, I tracked your phone. I discovered that you are now Henry Urquhart Drago's personal assistant after some brilliant detective work and a visit to your company's website, and even though you know what he did to me, you chose not to tell me about it, and then I began to wonder. Even when I gave you the chance to tell you, you didn't want to. And every time I tried to be affectionate with you this week, you rejected me." Julie suddenly felt her world turn upside down, and she began to realize how bad it looked in his eyes and how badly he was hurt. "No, Jake, you got it all wrong, He slammed his hand on the table, not very hard, but enough to make her flinch. She was even more stunned because it was completely different from her gentle husband. He continued as if he had not heard her words. "And so tonight my wife, who has barely touched me all week, goes out on a date with him in stockings that she never wore for me." Julie began to feel a real panic, and at the same time her thoughts returned to how wrong she was in thinking that she was the perfect wife when she could never do such a simple thing as put on stockings for the man she loved. How could she not know that this was important to him? But she should at least try to save the situation. "Jake, it wasn't a date. It was just a work meeting. Several people just canceled at the last minute. I know it looks bad, but you have to believe me. I would never." He hit the table again a little harder this time and raised his voice to a higher pitch. "Stop lying, Julie. You went to his house, the two of you. I think you discussed the annual report or the latest marketing data." Now she felt something like despair. "Jake, I know it looks bad, but the thing is, Carol was supposed to take me home, but she refused. And Henry offered me a ride, and then said that he needed to pick up something from the house, and that was along the way, and..." She felt silent before he interrupted, suddenly realizing how ridiculous it sounded. Henry was really stalling for time at home until she lost patience and called a taxi, which of course took time at such a late hour. Jake's voice returned to the low, even tone that started it all. "And so you went to pick up something at 11 in the evening and returned after 1 in the morning." For a moment, Julie couldn't continue, knowing that anything she said, even if it was true, wouldn't be taken for granted, and she couldn't blame him for that. She tried to approach him, hoping that a physical gesture would help when words could not, but he beat her to it, standing up and putting on his coat. She had rejected his attempts to get closer, and now he was responding in kind. She thought he was dressed to go out because he had been outside earlier in the evening, but now she realized that he was actually going to leave, that he was leaving. "Please, Jake, don't go. I know I ruined everything, but we can work it out. I know it looks bad, but I didn't cheat on you. You have to believe me." Even to her own ears, it sounded lame, and she had a nagging feeling that even though she hadn't slept with another man, she couldn't claim to be completely flawless. Jake walked into the hallway to the front door, then turned and looked at her, and for the first time his face fully reflected the pain he was experiencing. He could barely hold back his tears, and there was real, sharp pain in his voice, Why, Julie, what have I done to deserve this? I know I wasn't a perfect husband, but what did I do to deserve this? Without giving her a chance to answer, he walked out into the darkness. Julie stood there for a long time, feeling a mixture of heartbreak and a sense of injustice in a situation that made her look so bad, even though it wasn't true. A few minutes later, she tried to call Jake, but his phone was turned off. She wanted to leave at least a voicemail, but didn't know what to say. She sent a message asking her to return home. Jake walked aimlessly at first, but then his legs carried him towards the bridge. He had recently learned that the bridge was designed by his great-grandfather, Archibald Greville, who, when told it was impossible to bridge the chasm, took it as a challenge. Before he knew it, he was standing at the railing, looking down at the churning water below, which he could only feel but not see, in the darkness and eternal fog. The words of a song suddenly sounded in his head. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I came to talk to you again." He thought for a moment and then spoke into the darkness. "No, I won't jump today." It was Jake's ritual during his darkest days, his way of coming back to life and dealing with suicidal thoughts. At first, he avoided the bridge, but then, growing stronger, he decided to make it his test, to test himself, to stand looking into the abyss and defying. The abyss and defy its terrible pull. Now it seemed that he was in that state again, but despite the overwhelming feeling of despair, he knew that he now had enough strength to withstand any blows of fate. He imagined that the ancient gods, worshipped by the prehistoric peoples who lived here, might be punishing him for refusing to sacrifice himself by not jumping into the darkest moments of his life. But he quickly discarded this thought, as he was all too aware that his problems had a very real cause in the person of Henry Urquhart Drago. A phrase from one of the Lord of the Rings films, such reckless hatred, popped into his head, and it fit perfectly. Will this ever end? Julie was the best thing that ever happened to him. Beautiful, kind, loving, and optimistic. He felt like his life was finally on track, and he could live free from the curse of the Urquhart Drago family. Perhaps from today's vantage point, he should have told her more about what had happened, but he didn't want to dwell on the horrors of the past, so he only briefly explained to her his antipathy towards Henry Urquhart Drago. Then he laughed roughly at himself. Yes, he may have prevented her from cheating on her with his sworn enemy, but there would still be someone else in her place. And that's no better. He headed towards his sister's house. At least he still had Katie. And he has it. The good old days were back when it was just the two of them against the world. He turned on the phone to call her and warn her, and saw a missed call and a message from Julie. At first, he wanted to ignore it, but then he decided he didn't want her to call the police and sent her a short, sharp text telling her he would be at his sister's. When Julie received the message, she calmed down at least a little. She had always gotten along well with Katie and hoped that she could explain what had happened, and perhaps enlist her help in convincing Jake that things weren't as bad as they seemed. With this hope, she went to bed and was able to sleep a little, albeit restlessly. Waking up, she immediately felt a strange emptiness that seemed to hang in the air. The bed seemed too big, its cold sheets seemed to stretch to infinity, emphasizing her loneliness. She reached for the place where Jake usually lay, but only encountered coolness. The space he usually occupied was empty and dead, as if his absence was absorbing the warmth that remained after the night. This was wrong. She had gotten used to his presence, to the way his breathing was a barely audible background to her morning awakenings. The smell of coffee, usually so invigorating and warm as a signal to start the day, was absent. Instead, there was silence in the room in which she immediately felt uneasy. Jake always got up before her. His steps were quiet in the morning, but she knew every melody of this ritual. He always brought her coffee in bed, knowing that she hated getting up early. Her day began with his caring touch with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, which she served with a warm smile gently touching her cheek. But not today. Something was wrong today, and this silence was only getting louder. Julie began to think about all the little things he did for her without complaining or expecting anything in return. And too often she did nothing in response. Unbidden, his simple words from last night echoed in her head again. "You never wore stockings for me." She wanted to argue, which was ridiculous since he wasn't there. She wanted to say, "You never asked me for this." After all, he could just ask if he wanted. Only now did she remember that she didn't need to ask Jake. She suddenly felt inner discomfort. How could she be so selfish and not notice the obvious? Then she remembered how Jake had asked her for intimacy, or at least physical intimacy, a few days ago, and she had rejected him. She punished him. And for what? Because he is a man. Because he is not always confident in himself. Because he has his own weaknesses. For the first time since the wedding, Julie, standing in front of the mirror in a quiet bedroom, looked at herself in a new way, as if she was seeing her reflection through the eyes of a stranger. The dim light of the early morning filtered through the curtains, bathing the room in a soft gray glow, highlighting her tired eyes and slightly drooping shoulders. She noticed wrinkles that she hadn't noticed before, a slight hint of doubt on her face that made her freeze for a moment. Julie wasn't sure she liked what she saw. It was as if the previous confidence that she was a good wife began to come apart at the seams. She always considered herself caring, patient, and loving someone who is always there, who supports, who knows how to understand. It was part of her self-perception, her identity. Of course, Jake never complained. He was always attentive, skillful in love, and knew how to please her even in small things. Either bring a bouquet of her favorite flowers for no reason, or arrange a romantic evening to dispel her bad mood. He was a man who knew how to care, and she was used to considering herself worthy of this care. But now, as she looked at herself, doubts crept into her head. Perhaps she took it all for granted. Maybe her attention to Jake was not as sincere and deep as she thought. Did she really not notice his hardships and internal battles? Too immersed in her own thoughts and experiences. She knew she would have to make things right. She needed to find the strength to change what was wrong in their relationship, although she did not yet fully understand what exactly the problem was. First of all, she will enlist the help of Katie, her closest friend, who always knew how to give wise advice. Together, they will think about how to restore balance to her life, how to again become the woman Jake admired so much at the beginning of their journey. When Jake returns, she will be ready for a new chapter. She will need to start over with a clean slate and build their relationship stronger. But despite all this determination, Julie continued to convince herself that it was not entirely her fault. Jake was also to blame because his tense relationship with Henry cast a shadow on their life together. The pathological hatred that Jake felt for Henry Urquhart Drago seemed exaggerated to her, almost irrational. Was it possible to take their old teenage resentment seriously? It was just a children's drama, not worth ruining the present. Then Julie forced herself to stand, drank coffee, tidied up the house, and received a text from Katie. "I'll come by this morning to pick up Jake's things." The message was short, but the most important thing is that she will still have the opportunity to explain and correct everything. Soon the doorbell rang and she opened the door, seeing Katie on the threshold with 2 empty suitcases. Usually Katie smiled and hugged her, but not today. "Hello, Katie, I'm glad you came. Let's have some coffee and try to work things out." Katie looked at her as if she were some kind of exotic insect. "Oh no, I only came for Jake's things." She walked past Julie, leaving her standing confused in the doorway. "Look, Katie, I don't know what Jake told you, but this is some crazy misunderstanding. Give me a chance to explain." Katie ignored her, heading to the bedroom to begin packing Jake's clothes and personal belongings into suitcases. Julie was confused. Everything that was happening seemed absurd. She knew she had made a mistake, but she felt the reaction was over the top. She decided not to interfere for now and went into the kitchen. However, when Katie came out with her suitcases, she tried to speak again. "Please, Katie, give me a couple minutes. Give me a chance to explain everything." For a moment, she thought Katie would ignore her, but she stopped. "Okay, but it has to be something really significant." She sat across from Julie at the kitchen table, crossing her arms and sitting up straight, looking at her coldly, waiting for an answer. Julie suddenly found it more difficult to speak than she had expected. In explaining what happened and her reasons, she mentioned how important it was to keep Henry Urquhart Drago in good standing so that he would not abandon his investment in the company. But even in her own ears, it sounded unconvincing and accusatory, The silence of Katie, who simply listened with icy calm, made everything even worse. Julie finally felt silent, unable to find anything else to say. After a short pause, Katie spoke. As always, in the end, it all comes down to money. They always find people who are willing to sell themselves. For the first time, Julie began to feel angry. She was not some corrupt woman who sold herself to a rich man. It seemed to her that Katie and Jake harbored an unreasonable bias towards Henry. After all, in her opinion, he did nothing to deserve such hatred. Wait a minute, Katie. I made it clear that nothing bad happened between me and Henry. Katie looked at her with contempt. So you went on a date with him, knowing how Jake felt about him without telling Jake, then went to his house and spent 2 hours there alone. And you want me to believe that you played Monopoly or something like that? Suddenly an idea struck Julie. Listen, I'll call Henry and he'll confirm that nothing happened between us. She took the phone, but Katie's reaction was unexpected, full of sarcasm. Wow, so you call him Henry? Do you have his number in your phone? Julie was shocked that her ex-friend could speak to her in such a tone, but still continued, considering this the only possible way out of this ridiculous situation. Henry answered a few rings later, and she put her on speakerphone. Hello, Henry. Hello, Julie. Good to hear your voice again. How are you? I hope you've recovered from yesterday. Julie was slightly embarrassed to see the look of disgust on Katie's face, but decided to continue. Henry, I have a little problem. There was a misunderstanding. The thing is, my husband found out that I was at your place last night, and it seems a little awkward, so I need you to explain that it was completely innocent. There was a short pause on the other end of the line, and Julie suddenly felt uneasy. When Henry spoke again, his tone changed slightly. For the first time in their entire conversation, he sounded cold and even mocking. Don't worry, darling, my lips are sealed. As they say, a gentleman never betrays. I'll say whatever you want. We don't want poor Jake to think he's been tricked, do we? Henry's words felt like a physical blow. She felt as if someone she trusted had suddenly pushed her from the 10th floor. Without thinking, on pure instinct, Julie ended the call. Her first thought was that she was sure she had never told him her husband's name. It finally began to dawn on her how naive she had been. Katie said dryly, You know, if you were going to make a scene like that, you first had to make sure that he would support your version. Julie sat there, stunned. Then she spoke. I don't understand. All this because of a teenage fight over a girl. What's going on? Katie looked at her with such concentrated contempt that Julie instinctively recoiled. Then Katie began to speak in short sentences as if shooting out words. Teenage quarrel. His father killed our parents, Julie. Driving drunk. He got off with a short prison sentence. When he returned, he had to resign as a local deputy. He couldn't cope with the shame, and he died. Julie listened without stopping. It seemed that every word, every phrase hit her in the face. Henry decided that we, the 2 surviving children, were to blame for his father's death. He wanted to make Jake die, almost succeeded. He paid Jake's first girlfriend to be her first man and then made sure everyone knew about it. He framed the accusation of cheating on the exam and almost got him expelled. He bribed the girls to spread rumors that Jake had little dignity. When Jake found a girlfriend, Henry learned that her parents were tenants of one of his family properties. He threatened to evict her and forced her to sleep with him, filmed it, and sent it to Jake. By this point, Julie's face had become chalk pale. But you know what, Julie? Jake managed somehow. Most of all, he held on for me. It was just the 2 of us against a cruel world. But what almost broke him was what they did to me. Once at a party, Henry's friend slipped something into my drinks and then took advantage of me. Henry was also among them, and they took photographs. There was nothing I could do. They were all ready to swear that I agreed. By this point, Julie was feeling sick and starting to feel sick. Then Katie added, with obvious contempt in her voice, And you just made me hear that bastard's voice again. Julie wanted to beg her to stop. It was too much. What they did to me almost killed Jake. He went to the bridge. You know which one. The one above the abyss. The same one that they say that the ancient pagans made sacrifices by throwing people there. He was about to jump. I arrived there and spent 2 hours trying to persuade him not to do this. He talked all sorts of nonsense about how he had to sacrifice himself to the gods to give me the opportunity to live in peace. In the end, I threatened that if he jumped, I would do it too. And to be honest, I had similar thoughts myself. Katie looked at her with a challenge full of contempt and added, "So, Julie, this is your teenage quarrel." By this point, Julie was completely numb. All she could squeeze out was, "But why didn't he tell me?" Katie laughed bitterly, a laugh without the slightest hint of amusement. "I think he wanted to put it behind him. Start a new life. And I probably didn't want to burden you with this whole dark story. And how did that help him, right?" Katie stood up without another word and walked out with her suitcases. Julie remained sitting at the table, unable to move. How could she be so incredibly stupid? This question flashed through her head over and over again, like a painful echo that haunted her. How could she be so blind and not see the obvious? She felt like the whole world was collapsing around her, and there was no way out of this labyrinth of guilt and regret. Everything seemed lost. Every decision she made, every action she took was right, now looked like a series of unforgivable mistakes. And although she had the tempting thought of placing all the blame on Henry, because now she clearly saw that he was a truly evil man, a manipulator who skillfully dragged others into his games, it was not enough. Yes, Henry was the embodiment of evil, but that did not relieve her of responsibility. The real pain was that she could have thwarted his plans in a simple but important way, being a good wife to Jake. After all, it was so simple, to be honest, to be caring, not to hide anything from the man who always gave her his whole soul. Jake deserved so much more than she gave him. He was always a support for her, loved her unconditionally, supported her in all her endeavors, cared for her even when she took him for granted. All he ever wanted in return was her sincerity and attention. But instead, she plunged into her fears, her doubts, and as it turned out, into a naive desire to please other people's expectations, neglecting the most important person in her life. She now understood that no great feats were required to save their marriage. She didn't need to be perfect or infinitely strong. All that was required was to be honest and loving. To care for Jake the same way he always cared for her, giving his all. To be there when he needed her most and not run away into the world of his own illusions. Her mistrust and secrecy destroyed his faith in her, although he continued to hold on to their relationship to the last. Julie realized that maybe she could have protected their marriage from Henry and his games if she had simply been the wife Jake had always deserved. And now no one will believe her. Julie felt this hopelessness like a pressing weight on her shoulders. How to explain to Jake that her heart always belonged only to him, when all external circumstances, every word, every action spoke of the opposite? Henry, of course, will happily support the illusion that she betrayed her husband, sowing even more doubts in Jake. This insidious manipulator will easily convince anyone that Julie really did change, that everything was part of his plan. She had no doubt that Henry was enjoying this moment when his cunning trap slammed shut and Julie was left in it alone, defenseless, with a tightening noose around her neck. All evidence confirmed the version of betrayal. Every step, every casual glance, every action of that fateful night now looked as if she was deliberately moving away from Jake, succumbing to Henry's influence. After all, she really went to dinner with him, really hid it from Jake, although her motives were innocent. How can you explain the truth when the context itself works against it? Even the smallest gesture, like the new stocking she put on that evening, was now perceived as a symbol of her infidelity. She thought it was just a work meeting, but now all the details turned into incriminating evidence. How can she convince Jake otherwise now? How could she find the words that could erase the pain and betrayal that he was undoubtedly feeling right now? She knew there would be no easy excuses. Any explanation from her will sound empty, like another attempt to get out. How to regain his trust when even she herself was not sure that she could justify herself. Yes, there was no physical betrayal, but emotionally she had already betrayed him. By hiding the truth, avoiding openness, she allowed Jake to drown in his doubts and fears. But now, realizing the full scale of the disaster, Julie understood that words might no longer help. Her actions spoke loudest, and now she has to find a way to prove her love, not through empty promises, but through actions, through her every move and every look. But how to start this long journey if she herself didn't know if they still had a chance? As the day wore on, Julie's thoughts began to focus again on the injustice of what had happened. After all, she didn't really cheat on Jake. At the same time, having warmed up her condition with a couple of glasses of whiskey, despite the fact that she could not stand its taste, she began to feel sorry for herself. She decided to talk to her mother. At least she will understand and sympathize with her, perhaps even help, since she always got along well with Jake. Perhaps he would have listened to her. She quickly typed a short message to alert her mother of her arrival and boarded a train heading to her childhood village. The carriage was half empty, but Julie did not notice those around her. Her thoughts revolved around the upcoming meeting and what she was going to say. Outside the windows, autumn landscapes flashed scorched fields, sparse rows of trees, the bare branches of which were already losing their last leaves. Everything around reminded me of how quickly time is running out and how little time is left to correct mistakes. The train slowed smoothly as it approached the station, and Julie, taking a deep breath, stepped out onto the platform. She was overcome by a strange feeling of nostalgia mixed with remorse. As she walked down the familiar street toward the house where she grew up, her pace slowed. Ghostly images of childhood flashed through her memory: a small, cozy house, a garden where she played with her father, an old apple tree under which they had picnics. Now these memories seemed so distant, as if from another world. Julie realized that it had been at least a month since her last visit, and it made her heart clench painfully. Her mother had always been reticent in her requests for help or attention, but Julie knew how much these rare visits from her daughter meant to her. After the death of their father, whom they lost 2 years ago, when he was only in his 50s, her mother must have felt lonely. Julie reproached herself for the fact that in the bustle of her problems she came so rarely. The loss of their father was a big blow for both of them, but their mother endured it with amazing resilience, although Julie now understood that she most likely simply did not want to show her pain. When she finally arrived at a familiar house with peeling white paint on the shutters, she had the feeling that she had abandoned not only this place, but also her connection with her mother. That rare occasion when she came here seemed to her like a duty, not a joy, and now this feeling of guilt tormented her even more. Her mother was a widow left alone in this house, and although she never complained, Julie knew that her silence was a shelter for the pain that she held deep inside. Her mother, as always, was delighted with the visit, but the first question was not entirely convenient. "Where is Jake? I somehow thought that you two would come together." It was true. Jake always enjoyed spending time with his mother-in-law, although women's conversations probably sometimes seemed boring to him. Julie lowered her eyes, finding it difficult to meet her mother's gaze. "No, you see, our situation is a little complicated. I need to talk to you." After these words, she suddenly burst into tears, and her mother hugged her just as she had done when Julie was a little girl. When she finally calmed down, washed her face, and sat down at the kitchen table, the traditional place for all serious conversations in front of her, as always in such situations, was a mug of hot tea, this unshakable English remedy for all ills. Julie began to lamely explain what had happened. What was unusual was that her mother didn't just listen. She periodically interrupted her with questions that sometimes seemed aimed not at comforting, but rather at making Julie feel even worse. "Julie, how did you even end up working for this scoundrel?" I tried to refuse. But then Mr. Bilson, our managing director, came and literally begged me, saying that only Urquhart Drago could invest money to save the company from bankruptcy, that he wanted to work in the company personally for a couple of weeks to understand situation, and that he specifically asked me to be his assistant. Now, remembering it, Julie realized that there was something apologetic in Bilson's tone, and he somehow avoided looking into her eyes. Then she thought that this was her chance to finally get that promotion that she had been promised for a long time but was never given. And why didn't you go home and tell Jake that you were going to work for this bastard? Julie felt awkward in her chair. Well, I knew Jake was very irrational about him, so I thought it best not to tell him. Her mother did not ignore this issue. Was it better for Jake or for you, Julie? She couldn't find a good answer, so the mother continued. "Tell me, How did it happen that you wore sexy lingerie to a meeting with colleagues, the kind that you don't even wear for Jake, but you bought specifically for him? In a strange way, Julie suddenly realized that her always kind and loving mother could become a formidable prosecutor. It was Carol. She dragged me shopping and told me that we needed to make one last effort to please Urquhart Drago, that we could flatter his male ego by dressing sexy. Only now, looking back, did Julie understand what it all looked like, and why her mother put so much pressure on weak points. And this Carol is your close friend, right? Julie just shook her head. The truth was that until last week, Carol had barely paid her any attention, making it clear that she looked down on her. And didn't it seem strange to you that all the people suddenly refused to go to this meeting, although everyone said how important it was? At that moment, Julie wanted to ask her mother for mercy. All she could do was bow her head silently. There was a long pause. Not the friendly pause they sometimes shared at the table, but a heavy and unpleasant silence that made Julie feel increasingly uncomfortable. Then her mother spoke again. "So you were attracted to Henry's confidence. I think you compared them and thought Jake wasn't as confident." Her mother's words sounded unpleasant, but Julie still tried to justify herself. I think that was part of it, but this time her mother didn't even let her finish. "Do you think Jake has little confidence in his musical abilities? When he plays for you, does it seem like that?" Julie was surprised by this direction of the conversation. "Well, he has a studio at his sister's house, so he usually goes there to rehearse and record music and doesn't play in front of me." The mother looked shocked. She stood up, despite the pain in her hip from her recent surgery, and took a magazine out of the closet. When she returned, she placed it on the table in front of Julie, opened to a 2-page article with the headline, "Britain's Top 10 Rock and Jazz Guitarists," and pointed to a large photo of her husband. "So you're married to one of the best guitarists in the country, and you've never bothered to listen to him play." Julie tried to justify herself, but even to herself her answer seemed weak. "Well, I would listen if he wanted, but he never asked." Her mother, always kind and loving, suddenly mimicked her sarcastically. "He never asked." Then her mother looked at her sternly. "Lord, Julie, what did you expect? What will he say? Please listen to me play." Julie wanted to say that her mother was unfair, but she could not find a reasonable explanation. The mother didn't stop, so it's not about his musical confidence. It turns out that he copes quite confidently, although this is in no way your merit. The last words hurt Julie greatly, but she had nothing to object to. The mother continued, "So you're not talking about his musical confidence. Then which one?" The mother continued, "So what kind of confidence are you talking about?" "About his confidence in the kitchen, because every time I come over for dinner he cooks, and it's always impressive. And to be honest, I seriously doubt your confident Henry Urquhart Drago even knows how to boil eggs." Julie started to get irritated. It seemed to her that instead of the support and sympathy that she expected to receive from her mother, she was simply nagging and trying to hurt her. "No, I meant confidence with women. Jake is not always confident in relationships with women, and Henry seemed completely different in this sense." Her mother fell silent again, giving her another appraising look, full of disapproval, and then spoke. "I don't quite understand this conversation about confidence with women. After all, it's only about you. So answer me, daughter. After a year of marriage to you, do you think Jake has become more confident in his relationship with you, or less confident?" Julie didn't know what to answer. She wanted to say that Jake's confidence didn't depend on her, but she was beginning to realize that maybe that wasn't the case. Her mother didn't wait for an answer. "Do you try to dress sexy for him? Do you sometimes take the initiative in bed? Do you tell him how much you love him? Are you telling me how much you want him?" This time her mother waited for an answer, but Julie found it difficult to say anything. "It seems your silence is responsible for you." Then another question. "How do you think Jake is feeling now after what you did this week? How do you think he feels after finding the strength to survive everything that happened to him, only to end up with his own wife? His wife, Julie, betraying him with the same bastard." Julie sat with her head down, unable to say a word, but she wanted to beg her mother to stop to tell her. Enough, however, the mother was not finished. "I remember a few months ago, Jake came over to help me put together a table from IKEA. Julie raised her head in surprise. Jake didn't tell me anything about this mom, she said almost reproachfully. Her mother raised an eyebrow and continued, I wonder why. Anyway, while he was here, he got a call from Sting. I think you've heard of him. By this point, Julie no longer knew what to answer, feeling as if under a hail of blows, and could not even react to the slight irony in her mother's words. He invited Jake to go on tour with him in Europe. And Jake didn't hesitate for a second before answering that he couldn't, because he'd recently gotten married. Julie could only weakly respond. Jake didn't tell me anything about this. Mother shook her head. Of course he didn't say. After all, this is also part of how relationships work. Julie felt confused again. I don't understand. The answer sounded cold and destructive. Yes, it's obvious. I'm sure Jake would have loved to tour with Sting. It would have been a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, but he turned it down because he was committed to his marriage. He made that sacrifice easily, and he loved you enough to not make it your decision. There was silence as Julie tried to make sense of it all. What were you willing to sacrifice for your marriage, Julie? What were you willing to sacrifice for Jake? The tea in front of Julie remained untouched and was already cold. Nothing more was said, and her mother simply stood up and left the room. After a while, Julie got up, put on her coat, and left. There seemed to be nothing more to do, and the thought of staying even longer in the parental home, which suddenly became cold and joyless, was unbearable. On the train back, she tried to figure out how to move forward, but her mother's words kept ringing in her head. What were you willing to sacrifice for Jake? She still couldn't find the answer. Returning to their apartment, their empty, quiet apartment, she went straight to the bedroom and lay down on the bed, still dressed, even with her shoes on. Her gaze caught on the framed photograph. This was a photo Julie took when she was still an amateur photographer. She even won several competitions. She gave it up for some stupid reason that she couldn't remember now. The photo was of Jake at the beginning of their relationship before marriage, thoughtful and vulnerable. She used to look at this photo almost every day, kissing it as if it were a talisman, not believing that this wonderful, talented man wanted to be with her. When was the last time she even noticed him? Now she looked at the photograph in a new way. Julie sat and began to fantasize about a future in which she somehow managed to get Jake back. In this future, she would never take him for granted again. She'll ask him to play for her and become his biggest fan, even encouraging him to go on tour. She will begin to appreciate his quiet strength, his ability to endure the unbearable and still love, and she will reward him for being like that in every way possible. She will wake him up every morning with sex. She will force herself to get up at some inhumanly early hour and bring him coffee. She will wear only sexy lingerie for him, including stockings if he wants, even on the hottest days, and will never refuse him sex, no matter how, nor was it inconvenient. But she knew that it was just a dream of a future that would never happen because she destroyed it. Monday turned out to be worse than Sunday. Jake wasn't there, and there was no morning coffee until Julie forced herself to get up and make it. How many times has she made coffee for Jake in the morning? You could probably count it on your fingers. She noticed the unwashed cups, plates, and glasses, but was too apathetic to do anything about it, the mess cruelly accentuated by the sunlight streaming through the glass doors. Julie wasn't going to work. It was an unconscious decision. She didn't call, didn't take sick leave, and didn't have any contact with the office at all. It simply seemed unthinkable. She will never go there again. Her phone rang at 937. She looked at the screen and saw that it was Carol from her office. She ignored the call. The phone rang again at 9:43. This time she answered. Yes, Carol tried to be cheerful and enthusiastic. I noticed that you're not at work, honey. Everything is fine. No, Carol fell silent, a little confused. Julie was sure that the call was not her idea, and someone asked her to call. Are you sick? No. Will you come to work? No. Now Carol felt clearly uncomfortable. Maybe there is something. At this point, Julie lost her patience and ended the call. She didn't realize how time passed. The doorbell rang. It was 11:26. Julie went to open it. Standing in the doorway was her company's managing director, Peter Bilson, looking a little awkward in his suit. Hello, Julie. Can I come in? No. She even began to enjoy saying it. Then she realized that it would have been better if she had learned to say the word a week or so ago. He was stunned and didn't know how to react. Julie realized there was little about him other than his suit and his title. "Are you going back to work?" No, he was starting to look worried now, but she spoke before he could ask another question. "When I told you that Urquhart Drago and my husband had a rocky relationship and that I didn't want to be his assistant for a week, you told me to sacrifice myself for the team." Julie saw him become even more nervous. "Look, maybe you misunderstood me. I didn't mean that you need." She interrupted him, shocking him. "Oh, I understood everything. He asked me, didn't he?" Bilson literally retreated, and she resisted the urge to laugh, although laughter would have been devoid of any amusement. How could she even respect this coward? "Well, I assumed he had good reasons." "I didn't know." She interrupted him again. He was clearly not used to being interrupted by his subordinates, and Julie could see how hard it was for him to hide his irritation. She realized that he was truly frightened, torn between the potential scandal and the wrath of Urquhart Drago. "You didn't know, because you didn't want to know. You told me it was only for a week, and that I didn't need to tell my husband about it, and I was stupid enough to do that. And then you posted on the damn company website that I work for him." He flinched at the way the word damn escaped her lips. Before he could find an answer, she continued, "Well, I sacrificed myself for the team." He was almost comically confused. Julie then added, "It looks like my marriage was also sacrificed for the sake of the team." In the past, she had sometimes been annoyed when Jake called managers suits and secretly wished he was more like them. Now she understood what he meant. Bilson was nothing without a suit. Losing her patience, she simply closed the door, not slamming it, but enough to send a clear message. He looked worried as he walked away. He brushed the toe of one of his polished black leather boots against a gate post, ruining its perfect appearance, a fact he noted irritably as he climbed into his BMW. Julie watched him drive away. This meeting roused her to action, but soon the apathy returned, and she sat down again at the kitchen table. Nothing else of note happened on her day, and her office no longer contacted her. On Tuesday morning, Julie was still in the same state, in the same position at the kitchen table. Her phone beeped, snapping her out of the darkness. It was a message from her mother. It turned out that Jake unexpectedly agreed to perform at a concert in London with his former bandmates. He was in the group at the time they first met. The concert was supposed to take place on Friday evening. Without thinking it through, Julie immediately knew that she would go. In the almost complete silence of the dressing room, as his bandmates had already taken the stage, Jacob Greville felt a familiar sense of excitement. In the past, this has manifested itself as physical tremors before performances. However, the noise of the audience, warmed up by the host, began to penetrate the walls, and Jake turned into that same rock musician, Jake. He walked out into the corridor leading to the stage. An observer could have noticed how in these few meters he literally transformed. His posture straightened, he seemed to become taller. His gait became a mixture of a confident step and a dance, reminiscent of the movements of a master swordsman from times long gone, and now he has already stepped on stage in front of the audience. Jake was an introvert. He didn't like being around a lot of people. Even small groups could make him awkward. And he hated parties, but he was fine with an audience. After all, for him, the audience was a single whole with which he knew how to interact. Julie waited anxiously for him to appear on stage. She saw how a surprisingly petite drummer first came onto the stage and took her place behind the drum kit. Then a strong guy appeared and picked up a bass guitar. A thin man with arms that seemed a little longer than his body needed hobbled towards the keyboard. She began to wonder if she had made a mistake and if Jake would not perform at all, or if perhaps he was in no condition to play and had pulled out at the last minute. The presenter appeared on stage and began to speak. At first, Julie didn't pay attention to him, considering him unimportant, but then his words began to sink in. "Ladies and gentlemen, you are truly privileged because tonight, for once only, you have the chance to hear from a man who spends most of his time in the recording studio or writing hits for other stars. Meet him, the one and only Jake Greville." The audience burst into applause. The noise became almost tangible, like a separate entity, and so he appeared in the center of the stage, picked up the guitar casually through the strap over his shoulder, and quickly adjusted the microphone. Julie was amazed. She believed that Jake was simply the guitarist in the band, content to cede the spotlight to the frontman. But he was the frontman. Jake was dressed the same as she remembered him from the beginning of their relationship. Jeans, boots, and a leather jacket. God, he looked so good. She remembered with shame how she had once insisted that he wear a suit, saying that was how grown men should dress, and how awkward he had looked at a formal meeting in her office. She looked around and realized how many women in this room were looking at him with undisguised lust, and in some cases even with visible adoration. And then the music began. The drummer began the first track with surprising aggression, despite her small size, and then Jake began to play and sing, and his voice became a real discovery for Julie. It was not the quiet, uncertain voice of her husband. It was husky, full of power, and Julie felt her most sensitive parts begin to respond to the low notes he sang. Soon, Julie was gazing hungrily at this rock star on stage like a teenage fan, and realized it was her husband. However, it suddenly dawned on her that some of the girls in this room might have a better chance of spending the night with him than she did, and the thought made her shudder. If someone had told her this a week ago, she would have laughed at it. But seeing this confident Jake performing on stage, she realized that such a possibility was quite real, and now everything would depend only on his choice. She spent the rest of the concert in some kind of altered state of consciousness. At the end, when all the applause and encores were over, she had another revelation. It wasn't just an image on stage. In a way, this was the real Jake. Julie never allowed herself to see him in his natural environment, and then judged him for not fitting into something that was not his world, for looking awkward in a suit, for not being able to carry on small talk with leaders. She felt disgusted with herself, and almost began to hope that Jake would actually take one of these sexy girls she saw around. He deserved some kind of comfort. And if she couldn't be the one to give it anymore, then maybe she should at least make that sacrifice. He deserved someone better than her. But in reality, she shuddered at the thought of another woman enjoying his ability to give pleasure. When all the autographs had finally been signed, and the groupies' attempts to take him into their nets had been repelled, Jake picked up a bottle of beer and looked at his bandmates who had already taken their drinks. There was Lana, their drummer, who after her wild youth was now drinking lemonade, lounging on a worn-out sofa that had acquired some interesting stains over the years. Kevin, the bass player, satisfied a flimsy office chair that looked ready to collapse under his weight, drinking Prosecco straight from the bottle. And finally, Nathan, full of nervous energy, could not sit still for more than a minute, standing against the wall with a bottle of beer in his hands, still twitching. Jake gave them an idea of what happened to Julie. They had known him for a long time and were sympathetic, although Jake was grateful that they expressed it through the usual jokes and jabs. Lana said, "Hey, Jake, you should have gone to that last one. What was her name? Chalk. The only thing that would make her more straightforward would be if she just took her clothes off in front of you. And for a moment, I thought she would." The others laughed, and then Kevin added, "At least you could tell her I'm available." To this, Nathan replied, "Yes, Kevin, you are forgetting an important point." "Which one, oh wise one? You forget that we all become invisible in Jake's presence." Everyone laughed again, although this was not the first time this joke had been made. Jake laughed with them, realizing how much he missed the camaraderie of these friends. Part of him wished he could be that guy who could take a groupie for one night of meaningless sex. But he knew that just wasn't his style. At that moment, he decided that he needed to go and see Greta. Maybe she could help him find a way out of this. While waiting for her next patient, Greta Weinberg was uncharacteristically nervous. She glanced at the framed certificate of membership from her professional association hanging on the wall. It was such a part of the decor that she no longer noticed it, but now she imagined a faceless official marching into her office and ceremonially tearing it into confetti. She noticed a framed photo of her and her husband smiling at the camera, and it gave her some confidence. Their love was intense, and Paul even laughed at her for putting in a little extra effort when she got dressed that morning. He knew the story, and didn't feel threatened. Jacob Greville was her guilty secret, and she wondered if this would be the long-delayed day of reckoning. And there's nothing she can do about it if he decides to expose her unprofessional behavior. She was a therapist who initiated a sexual relationship with a younger, more vulnerable client who came to her in a desperate state, sometimes even prone to thoughts of death. Greta was not a hypocrite and knew how she would look at a male colleague who seduced a young client, and the fact that the gender roles were reversed had nothing to do with it. She lost concentration for a moment and remembered her first meeting with Jake. He was in terrible condition. I am convinced that he is worthless and doomed to contempt and rejection from women. At first, she even slightly wondered if what he told her was true. After all, otherwise he would hardly have been the first client to turn out to be a dreamer. But a little detective work on her part, and a conversation with his sister Katie, convinced her that, as incredible as it seemed, it was indeed true. Greta found it difficult to understand people like Urquhart Dragos, and this brought to mind the words of her Aunt Frita, also a therapist who fled Vienna and the Nazis as a child, retaining her Austrian accent throughout her life. Greta, my child, you must realize that there is such a thing as evil. Some people are born evil, and others decide to become evil. And there's more to it than just psychology. Jake's plight awakened Greta's desire to save him. She wanted to somehow make amends for what had been done to him. While in some ways she was inclined to almost laugh at Jacob's naivety, at the same time she cried at the results. The idea that he had somehow become monstrous fell on such fertile ground considering how damaged he was already. Greta's initial help was to use her various contacts to arrange solo gigs for him in some of the small clubs and backrooms of pubs, making sure that there were at least a few of her appreciative and supportive friends in the audience, developing that aspect of his work. His existence was not tainted by Urquhart Dragos, and she realized very quickly that he had real talent on the guitar, as well as a certain shy charisma as a performer that he was charmingly oblivious to. Greta was too self-aware to pretend that beginning a sexual relationship with Jacob was an act of admittedly unprofessional self-sacrifice. He was sweet and shy in his own way, and she was not immune to the attraction of a rock musician. However, she considered this the best way to make him believe in herself as a lover. And very quickly it became a reality. There was chemistry between them. An experienced older woman teaching her younger lover brought out a hitherto unknown kink in her, and Jacob was such a wonderful student. Greta still remembered in every detail that first day when she brought him back to her apartment, intending to seduce him. An expected knock on the door brought her out of her thoughts and back to reality. Greta squared her shoulders and, ready to accept her fate, invited him inside. Jake, who entered Greta's office, was remarkably similar to the young man she knew 6 years ago. But there were also differences. He was a man now, and his posture and body language conveyed more confidence than before. Greta was shocked to feel a physical response to his appearance, and with an ironic grin, she looked at her wedding ring to remind herself of the husband she loved very much. Then her eyes fell on the ring on Jake's finger, and she felt a tiny pang of disappointment. In all the years since they ended their relationship, she had never felt such a response to other men. But then she began to feel the same again. She pushed away these thoughts, invited him to sit down, and trying to keep her voice even and professional, said, "Before we begin, Mr. Greville, I want to apologize for what I did when you were my client. It was completely unacceptable for me to begin a sexual relationship with you. This is entirely my fault. I will completely understand if you wish to file a formal complaint against me with my professional association, and will accept the consequences. In fact, it would have been disastrous for her because it would probably have meant the end of her career, and she couldn't imagine doing anything else. But she understood that she would have to accept it." Jake looked at her, stunned. He was silent, and Greta began to feel a growing uneasiness, trying not to show it. Then he suddenly laughed and shook his head. "Oh my God, Dr. Weinberg, can I still call you Greta? It's strange to address you by your last name. Did you really think I was here for this? This is crazy. You are the person other than my sister who helped me change my life. And you think I'll file a complaint against you? Destroy your career? Greta leaned back in her chair with relief, but before she could say anything, he continued. When I came to you, I was broken. I was close to death. I saw myself as unloved and unwanted. Since then, no matter how bad things got, I never thought about it seriously, even when Julie, my wife. He fell silent, and Greta, no longer focused on herself, saw that something was bothering him. She needed to say something. Fine, thank you. I really appreciate it, and I have to admit, I'm so glad to hear that. In that case, how can I help you, Jake? Now he hesitated, trying to find the words. I'm not entirely sure. You just used to be the one who helped me understand what was what. Lately, I thought everything was going well for me, and then everything fell apart, and I don't know how it happened. I thought she was happy with me, and then Greta turned on her professional skills and gradually pulled out his story from Jake, piece by piece, step by step. Her first reaction was intense anger at Julie, even though she had never met her. It wasn't just because of Jake, but because Greta felt like Julie had kind of undermined her work to save Jake after everything he'd been through. But as she listened further, she began to realize that the picture wasn't so black and white, and she began to get the feeling that Jake needed some tough love. She gave him a look similar to the one that examiners give during the most rigorous exams and asked a question. Okay, Jake, how do you think we know Julie didn't sleep with Urquhart Drago? For a moment, Jake's mind seemed to go blank. The sudden change of topic and the way she asked the question caught him off guard. After a moment, he asked, truly perplexed. Do we know? She looked at him like he was a disappointing student. Yes, we know, or at least I know. He couldn't resist. Fine, and how do you know this? Think about it, Jake. Think about what this bastard would do if this happened. Jake was still trying to understand what she was saying. It was very difficult to think about considering all the pain associated with the idea. Greta tried to take a different route, which initially confused Jake even more. Jake, did you study Shakespeare at school? Yes, a fellow. Greta smiled like a teacher who heard the correct answer. Bingo. I hope you remember the main story. Yes, in general. So tell me, did Desdemona really do anything wrong? No. Now Jake began to guess where she was leading, but he still believed that the parallel was not entirely accurate. So, a fellow jumped to conclusions based on the handkerchief, right? Yes, but in this case it's not just about the scarf. Julie. Greta interrupted him. I'm not saying Julie didn't do anything wrong. But if she slept with Henry, we can be sure that he would. And here again, I remember Sherlock Holmes and the case of the dog that did not bark at night. Jake still didn't fully understand, so Greta decided to clarify. Listen, if Henry managed to get her into bed, he would definitely have proof. Even if he just kissed her, he would have filmed it, taken a photo, or recorded the conversation. And then I would be happy to show it to you. But he didn't, so he had to play the part of Iago and let your imagination do the rest. Now Jake understands. He was immediately reminded of the horror of what Henry had done to his poor sister and his cruel pleasure in sharing the photographs, or what he'd done to Jake's other girls before. He felt some relief. Everything turned out to be not as bad as he imagined. But Greta was just getting started. Maybe I'm also a little to blame for this, for the way I trained you. Now Jake was confused again, and it showed on his face. What? He tried to formulate a question. Most men are selfish lovers. They start that way and never change. She saw his confused look, but continued, You never had such a problem, but I still taught you as if it was your main task. Taught you that you needed to please me, as if that was all that mattered. At this point, Jake laughed and said, At the time it didn't seem so bad to me. Greta ignored this and continued, Yes, but this meant that you learned to give, but did not learn to take, ask, and sometimes even demand. Jake was even more puzzled. This is bad. I think in marriage, yes, Jake, marriage should be an equal partnership. Greta paused and continued. It seems to me that Julie is not that selfish, just a little inattentive. And you expected too little from her. Greta continued, giving more details and helping Jake understand that it wasn't just about sex, but other aspects of their relationship as well. Jake left her office later with a thoughtful look on his face. As soon as the door closed, Greta leaned back in her chair, took a deep breath, and turning to the photo of her husband said, Today, my dear, you will have an unforgettable night. I'm going to have amazing sex with you. She knew she could tell Paul, And instead of being angry that Jake had aroused her desire, he would only tease her, confident in her love for him. Greta packed her things and left, wondering if Jake and Julie could find their way back to each other. It was out of her hands now, and she could only hope that she had helped in some way. If anyone deserved happiness, it was Jake. When Jake left Greta's office on Saturday, he initially wandered aimlessly. Then, as was his habit, his steps led him to the Thames embankment. For some reason, he always found peace in watching the slow flow of the river, and now it helped him put his thoughts in order. He remembered how, in those terrible days after Katie had been attacked, his thoughts had first been about revenge, and then about death. Katie talked him out of it. He still remembered her words. If this scoundrel is killed, the police will not rest until they find the culprit, and you will be the obvious suspect. If you go to jail, I can't handle it alone, so he will achieve his goal to destroy our family. Jake had to admit that she was right. To succeed, he would have to get others to at least lie for him, risking not only their freedom, but theirs as well. Why didn't he intervene when he learned that Julie had been appointed personal assistant to Henry Urquhart Drago? It was as if he believed that his relationship was inevitably destined to end this way, as if there was a pre-written script that could not be deviated from. It was as if he wasn't the only victim. Julie was his wife, and he left her on a dangerous path. How could he do this to the woman he loved? And he loved her, he had no doubt about that. He saw her flaws, her sometimes unconscious selfishness, her trust in men in suits, but he still loved her. Jake failed her, not only in recent weeks, but also before. He demanded too little from her, and certainly did not express his expectations, hiding from her both the best and the worst that was in him. Why, out of fear that any confrontation would lead to her loss, he remembered Greta's words to him a long time ago about how we educate the people around us. He must have trained Julie to receive without giving, because she wasn't like that at the beginning of their relationship. Jake suddenly remembered how, just a few weeks into their relationship, he came down with the flu and Julie skipped her lectures, insisting on coming to his house, making tea, cleaning his room, and generally taking care of him. And in hundreds of little ways, he dissuaded her from this. It was getting dark now, and Jake had reached a part of the river that he didn't even recognize. But the decision he came to gradually became stronger. The next morning, he would take the train back to Wolfston. He still didn't know how to respond to the many messages Julie had sent him. This needed to be discussed face to face. Jake didn't know if they could make it, but he knew for sure that he wanted it. At the same time, he understood that this could only happen if they both began to be themselves. The day after returning from London, Julie got out of bed for the first time in a long time with a sense of purpose. After drinking coffee and eating toast, which she deliberately overcooked because the bread looked slightly moldy, she went to look for her camera. It had once been her pride and joy, always on hand in case there was a chance to take another prize photo, but it had sat at the bottom of the closet, forgotten, for over a year. She charged the battery, showered, got dressed, and headed out into the woods, camera in hand, leaving the house, which she had carefully cleaned the day before, to rid herself of the traces of a week of despair. Julie also left her phone, no longer wanting to answer calls from work, and no longer trusting that Jake would ever answer her messages. Julie realized the irony of the situation. The catastrophe that had happened in her life had finally brought her out of the house earlier than she usually woke up. Although the sun was already high, the forest was still shrouded in the remnants of fog, rising from a nearby chasm, creating the perfect atmosphere for her style of photography. She spotted a rainbow beetle slowly climbing up a moss-covered stump and crouched patiently, waiting for it to reach the top so she could get the perfect shot, the beetle standing out clearly against the murky depths of the forest behind it. While she waited, Julie was able to think about her situation a little more clearly. The threat to her marriage came not only from the events of recent days. She always knew deep down that Jake was successful. After all, he was the one paying for the mortgage. But she turned a blind eye to this. Why? She realized that this was necessary to justify her own life choices. Instead of studying in an area where she had obvious talent, art, and especially photography, she stubbornly insisted on taking a business course. She justified this by saying that she had to be practical, an adult, but perhaps behind this was a fear that she was not good enough to succeed. To make this choice seem right, she created an image in her mind of Jake as an unrealistic dreamer who needed someone like Julie to keep him grounded. This may have explained why she was so reluctant to listen to him play the guitar. After all, this would make her hard-to-found idea about him even more dubious. The more she realized the futility of her work, the more she became entrenched in her false worldview, trying to cling to the idea that her work had meaning and avoiding acknowledging her true nature. The beetle finally reached the top of the mossy stump, slowly climbing its rough surface as if overcoming invisible obstacles. Julie held her breath, waiting for the perfect moment, and when a ray of sunlight filtered through the dense canopy of trees, illuminated his iridescent back, she smoothly pressed the shutter. The camera clicked quietly, capturing the frame she had already seen in her mind. She didn't need to check the results. She felt in her confidence that she had caught that very moment. This was her calling, her true essence. Each photograph is a small world that it creates, an opportunity to capture fleeting moments and beauty that many do not notice. The real Julie is not the woman who sat in the office day after day, losing herself in routine, desperately trying to earn the approval of her bosses, completing endless tasks that seemed so pointless to her. Those tasks that once seemed important now paled in comparison to her true passion. How much time had she spent chasing a promotion that most likely would never have come, and even if she achieved it, it would not bring her real happiness. She knew this now with absolute clarity. Her life at the office desk is just a mask behind which hides a woman who passionately loves art and freedom of creativity. Now that mask was starting to crack, and Julie wasn't going to wear it anymore. She continued through the forest, feeling how nature was becoming her ally again. The trees surrounded her with a dense wall. Their shadows softly enveloped the ground, and the air was filled with the smell of wet moss and bark heated by the sun. Her feet walked easily on the soft, pliable earth, and each step she took seemed precise and appropriate, as if nature itself was guiding her. Finally, she reached a clearing. The forest suddenly parted, revealing an expanse filled with soft morning light. In the center of the clearing, as if preparing the stage for her camera, a sleeping lemongrass rested on a single orchid flower, a butterfly with delicate translucent wings decorated with thin golden veins. The orchid's petals looked as if they were waiting for her, perfectly spread, and the lemongrass seemed to be lying low, waiting for its moment of glory in front of the lens. He didn't move as Julie approached, which was rare for these wary creatures. She slowly raised the camera and, squinting, focused the lens, trying to capture the fragility of this moment, which seemed almost magical. Julie pressed the shutter, and the camera captured another shot, which she was completely pleased with. She began to wonder why Jake allowed her to act the way she did. Why did he never ask her for what he needed? The butterfly remained on the flower, even as Julie moved closer, step by step. Her fragile, translucent wings barely trembled in the morning air, but did not flap, as usually happens when such a sensitive creature senses the approach of a person. At first, Julie thought she was incredibly lucky, a rare moment when nature stood still for her camera. But the more she looked at the butterfly, the clearer it became that this was not just luck. The butterfly's wings were damaged, and one of them was slightly falling off under its own weight. Julie realized that this was not a stroke of luck. This was a broken moment, and the butterfly could not fly away. Her movement was limited, and she may never fly again. At that moment, it dawned on her. She suddenly saw a parallel between this tiny creature and Jake. He was broken too. How could he not be traumatized after all the horror that had befallen him in the past? All the cruelty and humiliation he endured left scars, even if they were not visible on the surface. Jake always tried to appear strong, not allowing himself to show weakness. But now Julie realized that the time of the day was not a little bit too long. And his wounds, like that butterfly, remained deep inside, hidden from prying eyes. He locked his traumas, his fears so far inside himself that he seemed unperturbed. But they were still with him, like an invisible weight that prevented him from breathing freely and being himself. And Julie realized that this was stopping him from asking for what he really needed. Jake never demanded attention, care, or recognition from her, not because he didn't want to, but because perhaps he didn't believe he was worthy of it. Like that wounded butterfly, Jake could feel that his wings could never lift him up again. He probably didn't believe that he deserved to be loved, and that anyone could serve him with the same devotion with which he always tried to serve others, even if it had to be his wife. She realized that he was afraid to ask for love and care, believing that it was better to cope alone. He is used to being the one who gives, but never the one who receives. If Julie could have been an unseen witness to a meeting taking place at the same time in her company's conference room, she might have felt some grim satisfaction. This meeting was scheduled for a Sunday to the displeasure of Henry Urquhart Drigo in order to avoid unnecessary attention. Henry Urquhart Drigo had been waiting for the results of his manipulation of Julie Greville for a whole week. Things looked promising at first. Julie was away at work, but then things went quiet, and even though he wasn't the most perceptive person, he couldn't help but notice that people were trying to avoid him. And now he was called to this meeting. Of course, this was expressed in polite words, but it was clear that his presence was required, and moreover, he was politely advised to bring a personal lawyer with him. When he entered the room with Martin Drake, who had already given legal advice to 3 generations of the Urquhart Drigo family, Henry was surprised to see at the table, in addition to the weak-willed Peter Bilson, Sir William Slent Smith, the chairman of the board of directors. After pleasantries were exchanged and coffee was served, Bilson began to lay out the problem. He explained what had happened to Julie Greville, pointing out that it appeared as if Henry had been pressuring her as a subordinate to spend time with him and possibly more. He stated everything delicately, avoiding direct accusations, but the hint was obvious. Bilson concluded by saying, "So as you can probably imagine, while there is certainly an innocent explanation for what happened, it doesn't look good, especially since Mrs. Greville didn't show up for work and made it clear to me that what happened that evening had a negative impact on her marriage." For a moment, Henry's face lit up with a grin of triumph as he heard the first confirmation that his plan might be working. Then the irony struck him. In reality, he didn't even try to sleep with Julie, but he did his best to pretend that it happened. This was the whole point of his plan. When they arrived at his house that Friday night, he initially said he needed to pick up something. Then he pretended that he had an urgent call and later said that he needed to write a letter. Henry then argued that he needed to take a quick shower and change out of his suit. He drew this out, figuring that he would eventually drive Julie home, cleverly arranging it so that Jake would see her get out of his car. However, when he finally came for Julie, she was no longer there. She left a note saying that she had called a taxi. Henry's failure to take action against Julie had nothing to do with morality. He certainly liked her, but all this was a consequence of an incident that happened a couple of months ago. Then he got one girl drunk and brought her home, intending to have sex with her, as he had already done with many others. However, when he undressed, her alcohol-dulled inhibitions disappeared, and instead of admiring his status and wealth, she laughed at the sight of him. Although Henry was not particularly given to self-reflection, this incident made him wonder, didn't all the girls he was with think the same thing, just not daring to say it out loud? He could no longer get rid of this thought. Since this happened, he has no longer exposed himself in front of women. However, Henry also felt that despite Julie Greville's stupidity, she still would not betray her husband. Then Sir William Slent Smith coughed to attract attention. For the first time he spoke. "You know, Henry, given what I've been told about your insistence that Mrs. Greville be appointed your assistant despite her obvious reluctance, and also given that you made it clear to Miss Carol Edenfield that she could expect a promotion if we'll provide certain services in this regard, you must understand that you have placed both yourself and the company in a very precarious legal position. I hope you can prove that this is all legal." As often happened when he was under pressure, Henry began to look for someone to blame. His gaze settled on Bilson. "You know, Bilson, I think you were the one who pressured her to work. For me, how was I supposed to know she would have a problem with this? My motivation was solely to provide an opportunity for a promising employee. The answer took him by surprise. Yes, you are right, Mr. Urquhart Drago. What I did was clearly a mistake, and as a result, I have offered my resignation to the council. However, the fact remains, it was you who organized everything so that she ended up at your home. Damn it, why did this person suddenly decide to become so principled right now when it was so inopportune? Before Henry could say anything, Silent Smith continued Bilson's thought. Obviously, if Mrs. Grebel can confirm that nothing inappropriate happened, then this situation can be resolved without too much difficulty. However, until then, it is better for you not to appear in the office, and of course, under no circumstances try to contact her. Is that clear, Henry? Henry had to agree, despite his inner rage. After all, Silent Smith was too powerful a man to be intimidated. It looks like he did a great job of exposing himself to suspicion of sexual harassment. His only option now was to hope that Julie Grebel would confirm his innocence. There was a certain tinge of irony in this. Having escaped punishment for the things he had undoubtedly done, Henry could now face serious consequences for the things he had not done. But Henry Urquhart Drago was one of those who never laughed at himself, only at others, and therefore did not find any humor in this situation. If he had been a wiser man, he would have noticed that his lawyer was suspiciously silent throughout the meeting. Meanwhile, Jake reached Wolfston shortly after noon and quickly covered the short distance from the station to their home. As he approached, he repeated in his mind what he wanted to say to Julie. He wondered for a moment whether he should ring the doorbell, then dismissed the idea as ridiculous and inserted the key into the lock. Without any conscious intention, Julie headed down the slope towards the abyss. Although she didn't think about it, the air gradually became colder and the fog thickened around her. Even at this late time of day, there were still remnants of fog in the hollows, indicating that she was approaching the abyss. The colder and wetter the air became, the gloomier her mood became. The day before, while still in London, Julie visited an upscale lingerie store, daring to go in, believing that it was unlikely that anyone would recognize her there. She bought enough beautiful but completely impractical lingerie to fill an entire drawer in their bedroom. However, now she was thinking about how unlikely it was that she would ever get the chance to wear those underwear for Jake. As she walked down the slope, Julie kept hearing her mother's words in her head. What were you willing to sacrifice for Jake? And she still didn't have an answer to this question. Jake finally made it to Wolfston, where he was greeted by an empty house. He assumed Julie would be there, waiting for his return. He was sure that they should talk face to face. But what he didn't expect was that the house would be empty. For a moment, he thought about what to do next. Then he decided that he needed to call her to find out where she was. Jake dialed her number and heard the cold, ringing sound of the phone she had left on the side shelf when she left. He froze in place. What now? How he came to this conclusion, he could never explain. It was intuitive knowledge based on fragments of information or something more unconscious. But he knew with absolute certainty where she was, and he ran out of the house, leaving the door open. He ran as fast as he could along the road that led straight to the bridge. From a distance, he saw that the bridge was shrouded in even thicker fog than usual. And although he could neither see nor hear anything specific, he had a nagging feeling that someone had already fallen from the bridge. The feeling was so strong that he stopped for a moment, feeling that he was already late. In front of him there was only white, faceless fog, and suddenly in one place the fog began to thicken, acquiring darker outlines, which soon turned into the silhouette of a woman. In that terrible moment, Jake thought that fate had played a cruel joke on him, that it was a woman who looked like Julie but was not her. And that meant that his real Julie lay broken somewhere below. But then he saw that it was indeed Julie, although she looked unusual. She was wearing one of his old t-shirts, jeans, and hiking boots, and had a camera slung over her shoulder. He reached her without even realizing how quickly he had covered the distance, and hugged her, exclaiming, "Oh God, I thought I lost you. I thought you jumped. I thought someone had fallen." At first, Julie looked at him as if she wasn't sure he was real, and looked like she was in a trance. She spoke in a strange, distant voice. Someone actually fell. For a moment, he didn't understand her. It was old Julie, the one who was selfish, the one who wanted you to wear a suit, the one who never listened to you play, the one who never put on stockings for you. At the end, her voice returned to normal, and there was even a slight smile when she mentioned stockings. Then she continued, "But I have to confess a terrible thing. She didn't jump. I pushed her. I sacrificed her for you." Now she finally smiled at him for real and added, "I have to admit, I didn't think it would work so quickly." With these words, she threw herself on his neck and kissed him so hard that he thought for a moment that he might have indentations on his lips. They quickly reached the house, and without a word, Jake picked her up, crossed the threshold, through the open door, and carried her with difficulty straight up the stairs. As they approached the bedroom door, Julie stopped him. Both knew without saying it out loud that they needed to make love, but she suddenly realized her unkempt state on her feet, all day disheveled hair, lack of makeup. Jake loved, "I just need to take a quick shower," and no, she was shocked by his sharp reaction. No shower, no makeup. At that moment, she realized that perhaps not only a new Julie would appear in their lives, but also a new Jake. She smiled at him and said slyly, "Then give me at least 2 minutes in our room before you come in. I promise you won't be disappointed. Maybe while you take off your clothes." With these words, she quickly disappeared into the room and closed the door. When he entered their bedroom, Julie stood by the window, illuminated by the light streaming in. Her hair was still beautifully tousled, just the way many men liked it. She wore white thigh-length stockings with lace trim and nothing more. "I put on stockings for you, dear. Do you like them?" Julie said, smiling slyly. They made love and then remained lying in each other's arms. Instead of the words they both wanted to say, they realized that they no longer needed them. Each knew that the other understood everything. Later, during a pizza dinner, they discussed their plans for the future. Jake enjoyed looking at the photos Julie took in the woods that morning and couldn't help but marvel at her talent. And later, he took his acoustic guitar and played for her a new song, which he had not yet finished, but which she immediately understood it was a love song written for her. The next day, Jake told her the whole truth about his past, even the most painful moments. They both cried, but then returned to discussing their common future, confident that everything would work out for them. Julie stood in the crowd again, watching Jake perform, but this time she wasn't hiding in the shadows. She was right in front of the stage. Shortly before the start of the concert, an employee approached her and, noticing her professional camera, tried to prohibit her from taking photographs. Julie happily showed him her official ID as the group's photographer, and he apparently recognized her last name, realizing who she was. Now, she may have pictures she can use on her new website, launched last week. She was surprised how many people wanted to buy her photographs of local landscapes. Jake just smiled smugly and said, "I told you so." At one point after Jake performed a particularly powerful solo, the girl standing next to Julie threw her panties onto the stage. Julie had no choice but to note with pride for her husband that her husband was capable of causing such reactions. She also liked that she was able to catch the moment of the laundry flying on camera. This photo probably won't end up on the site, but maybe she'll frame it and hang it up at home to make fun of Jake. At the end of the concert, Jake returned to the stage alone with a 12-string acoustic guitar and addressed the audience. I usually write songs for other artists, but today I want to play one of my new songs. My great-grandfather built a bridge across a chasm that was considered insurmountable, and perhaps his example inspired me. This song is dedicated to my wife, Julie. It's called Chasm and Bridge. With that, he sat down on the edge of the stage, a few feet away from Julie, and looking directly at her, began to perform the beautiful, touching song that she had already heard the first time he played it, just for her. By the end of the song, tears were streaming down her cheeks, but when she looked around, she noticed that she was not alone. After the audience asked twice for the song to be performed again, and the applause finally died down, a girl standing next to Julie suddenly broke the atmosphere by saying, "Crap, he has a wife." Julie couldn't help but laugh and, trying to remain serious, replied, "It seems to be true, all the best ones are already taken." Henry Urquhart Drago looked once more at his expensive, state-of-the-art GPS device, annoyed that it couldn't sense his disgust, or rather fear of the bridge over the chasm. But he knew that this was the only route that would allow him to get to the location of the midnight meeting on time. And although he usually considered punctuality to be something for the little people, it was better not to anger the assassin right now. This thought made him smile slightly. However, it was worth it to finally get rid of the Grivals and stop worrying that someday, waiting for the right moment, they would take revenge on him. No, his family did not reach their heights for many generations, passively observing what was happening. He will prove himself worthy of Urquhart Drago's legacy. He had already tried being careful, but it didn't work. Instead of committing suicide as he had expected, Jake forgave his wife, and their marriage seemed to only get stronger. Why doesn't life go according to the script he wrote? He even had to come to terms with humiliation. Salvation from possible serious legal problems came thanks to the fact that Julie Greville wrote a statement in which she confirmed that he did not force her to do anything. And this bitch refused to take the money he offered her or the company. And to top it all off, Jake is now famous thanks to the international hit The Chasm and The Bridge. Henry felt like fate was mocking him, trying to force him to swallow a moral lesson. But this time, everything will be different. He glanced at the nondescript black bag lying on the passenger seat, neatly containing packages of 100,000 pounds of cash. Henry thought it would be cheap, even at twice the price, to finally get rid of Jake and his sister, ending their line forever. Then he could set about restoring the Urquhart Drago family to their rightful place in the world. Without this annoying hindrance, he will be able to fulfill his destiny. In a few years, he will become a member of Parliament and perhaps in 10 years, Prime Minister. Now, all that was required was to come up with some simple populist idea that ordinary people would fall for. Henry thought about what formalities should be observed in negotiations with professional killers. Is it possible to demand specific methods of murder, or is it better to entrust this to the professional opinion of a mercenary? He also wanted Jake to know who ordered his death. It would have been ideal to be present, but Henry was sensible enough to know that it was too risky. He will have to give up this pleasure. No one can say that he is incapable of self-control. As he approached the bridge, his speed increased, as Henry wanted to get across it as quickly as possible and leave it behind him. Only when he had almost reached the bridge did he notice that the fog that usually hung over him had become even thicker, so much so that it was barely possible to distinguish the opposite side. However, judging that there was unlikely to be another car on the road at such a late hour, he did not slow down, even though visibility was getting worse every second. He entered the bridge at over 70 miles per hour, when suddenly the headlights of an oncoming car appeared ahead. He instinctively turned the steering wheel sharply to avoid a collision. The force of the impact caused his SUV to break through the guardrail on the bridge, and he fell down. At that moment, Henry felt as if he had been falling his whole life, waiting for a bottom that seemed not to exist. From the Wolf's Den Gazette, the driver of the van, who was in the oncoming lane, stated that an oncoming vehicle suddenly appeared despite ideal visibility conditions, which is extremely unusual in an area where there is often fog. The car suddenly turned off the road and crashed through the bridge fence. Police confirmed that there were no traces of alcohol or illegal substances in the deceased's blood. So far, they have not been able to find out why he was carrying a large amount of cash with him and why he made his trip so late. Henry Urquhart Drago was the last of an ancient family, and as he died without a will, it may be a long time before his rightful heirs can be discovered. However, none of them are known to bear the surname Urquhart Drago, so this line of the family has died out. The next morning, Julie and Jake ate breakfast in the kitchen where sunlight softly filtered through the windows, bathing the room in a golden glow. They chatted about plans for the weekend. Julie was going to a local craft fair, and Jake was planning to do some work in his studio. Their lives finally found harmony again when suddenly Jake noticed a newspaper folded on the table. He took it, intending to leaf through it, but already on the first page his attention was attracted by bright, almost sensational news. The face of Henry Urquhart Drago stared back at him from a photograph with the headline, "SUV fell off bridge into abyss. The last of the Urquhart Drago family has died." Jake froze and his heart began to beat faster. Memories of the past of what Henry had done to him, his sister Katie, and how he had almost destroyed his marriage to Julie came back so sharply that he felt as if he had stepped back in time. "What's there, Jake?" Julie asked, noticing how his face had changed. He didn't answer right away. He just handed her the newspaper. Julie frowned when she read the article and set it aside, turning to Jake. "He's dead," she said quietly, as if she didn't fully believe her words. Jake sighed, his gaze full of mixed emotions. "I think this is the end," he said, although in his voice there was not so much joy as relief. "He can't hurt us or Katie anymore." Julie nodded. She knew that this news meant more to Jake than just the death of an enemy. It was the end of a long and dark chapter of his life that had held him captive for many years. She reached out and squeezed his hand. "You are free now," she said quietly, feeling Jake tense. "Yes, but Jake paused, trying to find the right words. "It's kind of strange. For so long I dreamed of seeing his end, and now that it has happened, I don't feel any joy. He destroyed himself. I think this is the best thing that could have happened. You didn't let hatred destroy you. He did this himself." They sat in silence for several minutes, each pondering their thoughts. Julie suddenly realized that she felt a certain inner peace. Despite all the horror Henry had brought into their lives, his death seemed a strangely fitting ending to the story. But this was not their victory, and they did not need it. Now that Henry was gone, there was a new path ahead of them, free from the past. "Well," Jake said, leaning back in his chair, "I think we need to focus on the future. We have a lot of good things ahead. I have to finish a song for the new album, and you." He looked at Julie warmly. "You were going to show your work at the exhibition, weren't you?" Julie smiled, her heart filled with likeness. A future that seemed bleak just a few weeks ago now promised new possibilities. They dealt with their fears and pain, and now new horizons opened up before them. "Yes, and maybe I can even find time to take new pictures," she replied with a smile. The newspaper remained on the table, forgotten, while they returned to discussing their plans. Now there was no place in their lives for the ghosts of the past, neither for Henry nor for the dark memories of what he had done. That day, they went for a walk through the local woods, where Julie photographed the peaceful autumn landscapes, and Jake quietly played his acoustic guitar, composing a new tune as he went. Their life became a new story, free, happy, and full of light. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think. Click to the next one. 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 Click to the next one.